As Abigail said, what I want to look at is the way in which we do stuff with stuff. That's what's animated me throughout my career. I'm interested in the ways in which we use technologies in the broadest possible sense to enable us to do things and to enable us to do things at scale and scope, to do things we can't otherwise orchestrate, bring together, sustain without those technologies. And I want to look particularly at the role of representation in those sorts of technologies. I want to think a little bit about the ways in which working in that way comes not only with significant benefits, but also with a series of associated costs. And I want to think particularly about, referencing some more recent work I've been engaged in, how that understanding of the world might be helpful to us as we move into what is increasingly likely to be recognised as the Anthropocene. I'm working with some of the geologists who are involved in trying to get that recognition of the fact that our new era, the era we have been probably, the best guess I guess is probably mid-40s is when you'd start it, that we are now so significant an influence on the world system and the Earth system, the ways in which the planet sustains itself, persists, that we have to think about factoring that into how we think of the eras of the Earth's life. And then finally, as Abigail said, you've got to give a sop, throw some meat to the audience. I'll have a little reflection on academic freedom at the end. So that's the plan. Let's see how it goes. So, a little bit about me. Well, that's a bit of a rhetorical flourish, isn't it, really? Because it's all about me today. But I am, for my sins, a lapsed psychologist. I think people who study psychology end up doing one of two things with it. Either they make a fruitful and marvellous career, or they run away screaming. I'm in the latter camp. I signed up to do a psychology degree, naively thinking I'd get to think about dreams and what they meant. And instead I got to train a rat to press a lever many times before it got a pellet. So my flight from psychology was enabled by a PhD at Edinburgh under the auspices of what then was a flood of money from the Economic and Social Research Council to fund 5 major centres in the UK in its programme on information and communication technologies. And this dates me a bit. The kind of intent behind that programme, the unwritten sense of the urgency of why that work was necessary was it was apparently going to enable us to leapfrog the Japanese in information technologies. That was the lurking thought. And the inelegant title I ended up with for my PhD was Discourse and Socio-Technical Transformation, the Emergence of Refinery Information Systems. It's a page turner. My dad actually read it. Bizarre. And a lot of this work came together in a book from, I think that's now 20 years old, representing organisation with a couple of colleagues. But a lot of my PhD was in that, along with other bits and bobs. So, the PhD, in practical terms, involved me hanging about an oil refinery for about 2 years. I don't recommend it, they're smelly things. And everything you're told in the safety training for the site is honoured in the breach on a minute-by-minute basis. But essentially what I did was I wandered about, mainly in the administrative blocks, talking to people about what they thought they were up to. They were in the process of attempting to integrate the different systems through which they modelled different parts of the refinery into some overall model of how the refinery would work. And that's because they felt that they were increasingly being managed by the plant rather than managing the plant, and they wanted to get some more control of it. Now, for those of you who don't know, crude oil refining is a relatively simple matter in basic terms. It's much more complex in more sophisticated terms. But in basic terms, what you do with crude oil is you separate it into different bits, different lengths of hydrocarbons, essentially. Now, what you end up with is a mix of those things, some of which are considerably more valuable than others. And other processors at refineries try and break down the bits that aren't that valuable into being the bits that are more valuable. Now, the sorts of things that fascinated me and continue to fascinate me around that are things that are kind of signalled by one aspect of the system I was looking at, a thing called the mass balance reconciliation system. Now, the mass balance reconciliation system would try to work out when some product had left point A and supposedly went to point B, but didn't register on meter C in between, what was wrong? Had the stuff not moved? Had the sensor not worked? Had the receiving tank not captured the fact that the thing had arrived? And I've given you a more parochial example down the bottom there. That's my bloody dashboard on my car, which perpetually has that symbol flashing at me. And every time I take it to a mechanic, he goes, oh, there's something wrong with the computer system or the lights, mate. You don't want to worry about that. So I carry on driving it. One day, of course, my car's going to explode while I'm on the motorway. And the police will arrive and say, didn't you pay any attention to that flashing yellow sign? But it's a perennial problem. If a sign tells us something, how do we know that the sign is right? And if it's not right, is it something to do with the sign, or is it something to do with the underlying system that the sign is trying to inform us about? After my PhD, I had the pleasure of working as a researcher on a couple of funded projects with the delightful Mahmoud Ezamel and Hugh Wilmot at what was then UMIST, projects funded by the Institute of Chartered Accountants for England and Wales and the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. And they were basically projects trying to look at how management had changed in the flurry of activity that came along with the kind of neoliberal reorganisation of the economy that took place in the 1980s. So this was things like delayering, just in time, total quality management, endless fascination with culture change. Organisations wanted to change their cultures right, left and centre. So the example I've picked up here in a paper from Accounting Organisations and Society was some work we did looking at, in some detail, at changes going on in an aircraft manufacturer. Now, the zeal of the changes is kind of indicated by a number of things around this. Some of the people we interviewed described themselves as evangelical management accountants. Strange breed, and not a creed I'd sign up to myself, but they were interesting people. The most interesting guy in our study was a chap who'd done an MBA and obviously worked in the car industry before coming to work in aircraft manufacture. And he was endlessly frustrated with the engineers he found there who saw themselves as some sort of artisans. He didn't like that at all. He had the factory cleared, painted most of it blue, and then put grey lines on it where the work was meant to flow. He described it as building a motorway to the future. And he wanted these people, these previous artisans, to see their work in making planes as a bit like shelling peas. Wasn't having any of this craft nonsense. And they also started running very, very sophisticated just-in-time systems. And the quote there on the dust test really stuck with me at the time. I was interviewing this guy, he looked out the window, and there's a huge nose cone about to be assembled onto this plane. And he said, those things out there, they're on the dust test. So in the process of this transformation, something that a year before would have just been seen as an inconvenience or a reason to sack the cleaners for not doing the job well enough has suddenly become the most important economic indicator as far as this manager's concerned. If a nose cone that costs £1 million has been sitting there long enough to gather dust, you have wasted a considerable amount of capital funding its presence, and you didn't need to do that. One of the other things I particularly liked about his work on reordering the factory was that every now and then when he was bringing dignitaries down from head office, he'd be walking them around, and the rather more waggish members of the remaining staff, still somewhat smarting at their lack of artisanal status in the putative future, where they would put ducks on the rubber ducks on the blue bits of the floor, and then they would hide themselves behind various dividing walls around the place. And as the dignitaries were going past, they'd make duck calls. I have a childish sense of humour. More recently, a similar thing, trying to understand how people make sense of the objects that they work with and through. So this is a study with some colleagues in a specialist hospital, looking at the ways in which the hospital's reorganisation to cope with the COVID pandemic became freighted with huge amounts of symbolic significance, but also moral significance. So there'd always been talk about a central corridor in the hospital and what it meant and what it did. But the process of shifting a load of people to working from home and another bunch of people from working on the premises produced a divide and and it enabled people to kind of see the corridor differently. And I heard today actually that our follow-up paper to this one in the same journal, focusing much more specifically on the corridor and from where this picture comes, got accepted today, so that's nice. So in all three cases, I'm intrigued by the meaning of things and how people work with things, and I'm interested in the way in which the meaning of things shifts and how those things act as conduits to other worlds, how those things augment the here and now with the there and then, either from the past or in the future. Images are treacherous things, though, as indeed are words, and the relationship between words and images is treacherous enough. When you actually throw in the matters of the world as well, the treachery abounds and multiplies. And just like that indicator on the car dashboard, you never quite know which one of them is being unfaithful when a story isn't travelling properly. The meaning isn't travelling as we'd expect. So this is the bit, if I were selling shampoo in the 1980s, where I'd say, here comes the science bit. I was fortunate enough to work in his later life with Bob Cooper, and he also examined my PhD. And I suspect, probably, I can say this without exception, nobody's work influenced me as much as Bob's did. He was an iconoclastic thinker, an absolutely appalling work colleague lots of the time, but absolutely brilliant, phenomenally brilliant. Hardly ever managed to publish anything in any sensible places because nobody wanted it. Was almost impossible to work with because if you tried to change a word, he would lose it completely because he spent so much care over each word. But a genius. Real insight into the world. So these quotes here are all taken from a piece he published in an edited collection in 1993. And they try to get to the heart of this issue that I'm grappling with. How do we work with technologies? What's the relationship between technology and representation? How do we use technologies to bring stuff that isn't with us now into our purview, into our calculations, into our thinking, into our planning? According to Bob, and I think he's right, technology and representation are immemorially connected. There's always been a relationship between technology and representation. And for Bob, the key insight there is that the representation is our response to our body's inadequacy in the world, our body's fragility in the world, our body's limits in the world, be they cognitive or physical, or conceptual even. All representations originate in the instability of the body. All techne, the ancient Greek term for technology of this sort, all making flows from this need of the body to represent itself in terms of more durable external structures. And that entails a couple of moves. First of all, you have to kind of look at the body and work out where it's holding you back, and then capture that some way. But capture it in a way that turns a deficit into a benefit, that turns a cost into an opportunity. And then you augment the body with that which you've taken from it and brought back to it. I'm going to need to unpack this a little bit, I think, in a couple of the next slides. And then that immemorial process undergoes a qualitative change with the inception of modern technology and modern technologies of scale. Instead of the more ancient concern with just making something present for apprehension or use, as chance might allow, so I guess the most obvious example would be a sail. Yeah, it only does the work you want it to do when there's wind in the right direction, compared to, say, an outboard motor. Modern technology puts the stress on immediacy of use, constant availability, and easing of effort. It turns the world into a standing reserve for human use. And that's great. It gives us all sorts of benefits. But it comes with costs. It comes with costs particularly when that worldview, when that way of seeing how we are and how we can be in the world takes precedence over all others and crowds out the space for other ways of capturing the world and thinking about it, like the ways of art, for example. Now, my two key sources, apart from Bob, and I'm sure I came to these sources through Bob in working this stuff through, were both literary theorists. So Sam Weber, there in the top, what's it to you? Top right-hand corner, Mass Media Auras, fantastic series of essays. The one that particularly took me is one about television. The essay's called Television, Set and Screen. And he looks at the way in which television, in a number of different European countries, the ways in which television is both a surface on which we can see distant aspects of the world. It sets before us things that aren't here, in the here and now. But it screens the fact that it's doing that. It hides it, and we look through the television as if we have a natural purview on the world. But of course we don't. We're looking at a world radically altered and changed and denatured in many ways by the presence of the technologies that enable television to work. And entertainingly, he then draws out the things that seem to attract most attention, and be aware of the fact that this is obviously pre-on-demand television. So, what really captures our attention on television, and he claims this is the case in all three of the kind of different terrains in which he looks, it's things like sport. Now, why is it things like sport? Well, Weber's answer is because actually the technology of television in bringing everything closer together, making us able to see things from afar, has altered the world radically and destabilized it. And thus the thing that we like to use the technology for most is a comfort blanket. We watch things that deliver certainty because we're living in a world that's now more uncertain, more confused, more difficult to navigate because of the technology that we've deployed within it. And we mollify ourselves by watching people chase a bladder around to an outcome that is agreed and unchallengeable. Again, we're talking pre-VAR here. Elaine Scarry, Harvard literary theorist. That book is a hell of a read. I recommend it if you've got a strong stomach. But effectively what Scarry did in that work is look at a series of reports from Amnesty International on torture. And one of the things she finds, tragically I guess, is that our kind of Hollywood versions of torture, in which there are elaborate torture implements, doesn't actually marry up much with the realities of the world. Torture is generally inflicted, almost always inflicted, with everyday objects. Really everyday objects. Everyday objects that become menacing in the way in which they are taken out of their normal domesticised use and instead used to inflict pain. And what she draws from that is that the process of that torturing is a dehumanisation. It's a way of reducing the subject, narrowing their world, to as small a point as possible until they crack and will tell you anything, which is of course why torture is an absolutely useless mode of engagement with an enemy, because its consequences are that you get unreliable information from people because they'll tell you anything to make it stop. But what she does by effectively, she reverses that. So it's like, if that's how worlds are reduced, then the converse is how worlds are made, augmented, extended. That's how we increase our reach. That's how we are in the world and extend ourselves into the world. Other sources that influenced me around about the same time. So that Tracing the Semiotic Boundaries of Politics is where Bob's piece that I was talking about earlier appeared. I'm going to come on to the formal organisation as representation piece in a moment. But Bob was drawing upon, and lots of people were being very influenced by this, again, another Harvard academic, Shoshana Zuboff, probably more famous now for her more recent work on surveillance capitalism. But at the time, she was looking at, again, similar processes to the one I was looking at, the ways in which information technologies were not only being used to automate existing manufacturing processes, but were in the process informating them. They were necessarily generating an informational excess as part and parcel of the way in which the automation was going on. And if you want an explanation as good as any for why we have so many managers in the world, it's that. Yeah? Information begets management, management begets information. Without information, you can't manage. And the proliferation of information is what proliferates management. I've got Ephemera up there, the Open Access Journal, because to my delight, I am about to publish a co-edited issue of that with a couple of colleagues from Bristol and Copenhagen Business School, where we have gone back and looked at some of the more weird and wonderful output of Bob's work that never ever got published anywhere, or if it did get published, you can never find it. Now, these things circulate as mimeos or photocopies amongst the faithful and have done for years. But we thought that we should probably take this out to the world. So we've published 6 of these pieces, but also invited commentary upon them by a number of current scholars to look at how they might be useful for contemporary debates. Bob's most elegant paper, I think, is probably now only findable in this book, a collected gathering of his work put together after he died. And the title of the piece is Formal Organisation as Representation. And the subtitle basically tells you the entire argument. So, Bob's contention is that organisations are increasingly processors of information, if they were ever anything else. But an increasing and more prominent function that they engage in is processing information. But that arrives in the second act. Before you can process information, you need a representation. And that representation can either be diminished or strengthened, augmented or weakened by the information that comes to it. But the information cannot register, cannot do anything without an existing representation. Now, what does modern representation, this kind of grand scale representation, entail? Well, for Bob, it's about remote control. Yeah? It's about building centres of calculation in which stuff is gathered and then people pore over it and decide what to do. It's about expanding power, expanding influence. Now, how do you gather things together to do that with them? Well, first of all, you've got to make them as small as possible because they've got to travel, and then you've got to move them. Yeah? So representation involves remote control enabled by abbreviation of the world so that the world, those aspects of the world can be displaced, can be moved, can be gathered together and treated as one, dealt with on the same tabletop. There's a nice pre-digital example. I don't know how many of you came across this at the time. I only heard about it actually a couple of weeks ago. A number of the successful escapes from German and prisoner of war camps were apparently enabled by a fake charity working for the British state, sending out copies of Monopoly. Nice thing to keep the lads distracted, stop them building tunnels. But within those charitably distributed copies of the innocent game were silk maps, folded up as small as possible so that they would fit inside the pieces of a Monopoly board. That's how a number of the escapees knew where they were escaping to, because somebody had already been there, made a map, produced it, reduced it, displaced it, and delivered it to them. That's how they knew where they were going. Now, quite why I picked the picture from the film with the two saddest characters who get the grimmest demise is still beyond me, but there's the great escape. And of course, once you digitise, once your information is being carried, once your representations are being carried by bits, that process radically accelerates and radically hyperbolizes. So that's the other problem. And Sam Weber's already hinted at it where we saw earlier. When you pull stuff together in this way, you make the interactions between it much more rapid, much more thoroughgoing, and much more unpredictable. So Chuck Perot's book from the early 80s, Normal Accidents, effectively looks at systems that have been involved in disasters, really, and tries to unpick common patterns. And the patterns he picks up are that most disasters involve four things. They involve an active error. So somebody using the technology does something stupid with it, or something ill-advised, or something ill-informed. And that couples with a latent error somewhere in the guts of the system, and it's that combination that produces the unpredictable, disastrous effect. And it's more likely when two conditions are met. When the things in the system are complexly interlinked, so it isn't that one thing is just connected to one other thing, but the connections ramify. And also when the elements of the system are tightly rather than loosely coupled. If something's tightly coupled, the effect flows through it almost immediately, almost automatically. If it's loosely coupled, there's a gap. Yeah? And you see this today with some of the discussions around connectionist artificial intelligence. Yeah? There aren't many people who are utterly resistant to artificial intelligence. The resistance is rather, I don't want it deciding on its own. Yeah? And if I go back to my time with the oil refinery, one of the mantras that I heard throughout that is, we don't want to do people's jobs for them, we want to do about 70% of their job for them. But we want them to fill in the remaining bit. That's the safety check. That's the balance. And the second book there is the brilliant but toxic Martin Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology. It's Heidegger who talks about this notion of turning the world into a standing reserve through the ways in which modern technologies represent it. But in the process of doing that, we tend to create gigantic representations that become ever more all-encompassing. And instead of technology helping us with the problems that we found in the world, we increasingly find ourselves spending our time using technology to address the problems that the technology we've deployed in the world has created because of the gigantic system that we now have of interconnection. Yeah? It's a dog chasing its tail, if you want an image to try and capture this. Now that sort of thing is rendered in tragic comedy terms in films like Terry Gilliam's Brazil. For those of you who've not seen it, again, I recommend. That's Robert De Niro on the left there. He is a terrorist heating engineer in a totalitarian system in which the heating engineers that the system supplies can never solve the problem with the technology. They put the wrong size beam in. They bring a fitting that related to the old iteration of the system. Bob, just swoops through the window, comes in, puts a pipe between the ducts that aren't connected and swoops out again. Yeah. In the process of an arrest warrant being generated for him, a fly falls into the printer. And rather than the warrant being for Tuttle, it becomes for Buttle. So Tuttle is the Robert De Niro character, the terrorist heating engineer, and Buttle is Sam in the film, the central character who endlessly dreams of flying away and eventually loses his mind. It's a film that's way too long, but certainly about the first half hour is amongst the most visually arresting imagery of what a dystopian technological future can and does look like. Here's a rather more sobering and real example from much closer to the present day. The imagery to your right is the wreckage of a Boeing 737 MAX that went down in Ethiopia, killing, I think, everybody on board, about 140 people. And the fleet of these planes was grounded for a period afterwards because it wasn't the only such incident. And what seemed to be going on in the background was that a well-meaning attempt on the part of a piece of software to make sure that the plane didn't lose height when taking off was doing battle with the more situated understanding of the unfolding circumstance of the pilot and overriding the pilot and crashing the plane into the ground, preventing the pilot or reinterpreting the pilot's attempts to take ameliorative action with the result of loss of life and technology. So my core ongoing interest, and this collection of work edited by John Law came out in 86, I think, when what was called actor network theory, or one of the strands of the kind of sociology of knowledge and technology, was first coming into being. And it's a series of essays by the great and the good in that emerging area. And what they're really trying to get at is how do people and things build networks of each other, and who gets to speak for those networks, who gets to represent them, who gets to own them effectively, who gets to claim their benefits. It's not really sociology, because there's much more technology in it than you'd normally get in sociology. It's more an asociology. How do things come together with people? How are they built into networks? Who speaks for those networks? And how do those networks marshal and deal with the competing interests of the elements? Now, in more recent work with my colleagues in the Anthropocene Research Group, those weird and wonderful geologists, we have been trying to look at the ways in which that form of understanding might enable better responses to the emerging Anthropocene. Might that way of thinking enable us to find ways of talking to carbon and finding out what it wants? Might it help us find ways of talking to COVID? Might it help us find ways of talking to water? Might it help us find ways of opening up the very narrow and short-term cycles associated with standard business decision-making with the very much more longer-term cycles in many cases, and cycles working at different scales and scopes that make up the Earth system that we are increasingly disturbing to the point where it will be unsustainable. Now, that invocation of the notion of representation and democracy is deliberate. Yeah? Just as we have a number of disenfranchised populations that find it hard to have their voice heard, and we strive to find ways of bringing them into conversation. We do that because that's the best way of dealing with this, because if you don't do that, you are confronted by people with pitchforks and torches and masses of anger. Yeah? And the same thing is going on at the moment with the constituents of the Earth system. We can either find ways of commercing and conversing with those systems better, to better understand them and better bring them into our decision making, or they won't bother to talk to us. They will just wipe us out. They won't wipe out the world, They'll just wipe out the irritating species that we've become. In the realization of the benefits of scale, of the advantages of centres of calculation enriched by these travelling representations of different aspects of the world to allow command over a large scale of terrain and time, violence is happening. Various voices are being shut down, as well as spokespersons for conglomerations of gathered materials are coming into being and getting heard. As Michel Calon says in that article, in that collection I just put up, to speak for others is to first silence those in whose name we speak. And that handsome chap to your right is a scallop. Calon's paper in that collection was about the scallops and the fishermen at St. Briox Bay off the coast of France. And as various people looking at the article have pointed out ever since, the scallop never speaks to us directly. Somebody always has got to intervene and speak for the scallop. Now, if that's a benign power in relation to the scallop, that's probably to the scallop's good, but it might not be. So, I'm currently working then on an agenda of how we bring, through representation, the voices, the concerns, the interests of what we previously considered to be inanimate matter into our considerations, because it's becoming increasingly important that we do. But to do that, we probably need experts. We probably need scientists, artists, those who find ways of understanding the interests and speaking for the otherwise mute elements of the world that we need to attend to. But expertise is in bad odor at the moment. And it's in bad odor both from the unprincipled and opportunistic right, as much as it is from the principled, and indeed first principled arguments of a rather more reflective left. Okay? And the tension is an age-old one. The tension between democracy and technocracy. We need expertise. We need expertise to make the right democratic decisions. But if only those who are credentialised and authorised to speak in that way are the voices that heard, then democracy dies. And as Terence Curran has pointed out with his colleagues, Terence obviously not long ago of this parish, the balance that one can possibly put in place there is academic freedom. The rigorous disputation by informed others of the authoritative line on a particular subject or thing. But as Terence and others have highlighted, protections for academic freedom in the UK are notable, most obviously, by their absence. There's a lot of lip service paid, but you never find out whether your academic freedom is protected or not until in practice. Which takes me on to, I think, my last but one slide, you'll be pleased to know. My latest book, coming out, is in press at the moment, it's out later this year, looks at a case study of change at a British university. According to the law, academics enjoy freedom to question and test received wisdom and put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges. But the case we look at involves the dismissal by reason of redundancy of academic staff because of a strategic decision on the part of the university in question to disinvest from research characterised, in their words, in the italics at the end, as entailing a profound questioning of the authority and relevance of mainstream thinking and practice. It's virtually unchallengeable. An employment tribunal has no interest in academic freedom. If you try and take this to judicial review, you will hit the bifurcation in the institutional nature of an institution, such as a university. A university is a public body and has public duties associated with it when it is performing as a public institution. Included amongst those would be the protection of academic freedom. When an institution such as a university chooses, however, to make a strategic decision, then it is acting as a private body. And when it acts as a private body, those constraints do not apply. So, drawing to a close, what's the point? What's the point of all this, particularly when there's no wine afterwards? What's the point? The point, I think, is to understand how the world's put together. And to try and do that in novel ways, because understanding it in different ways increases our potential purchase upon it. And if we understand the way in which the world's been put together and is producing effects that we don't particularly like, we've probably got more chance of resolving them and addressing them. And so my final substantive slide is the compulsory lengthy quotation from a literary source. In this case, I've gone for Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. If you haven't read it, central character is Billy, and all you really need to know about Billy is that he has a curious relationship with the world and time, and often witnesses things backwards. And in the particular instance I'm going to share with you, what he witnesses backwards is a film about the bombing raids on Germany. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the machines. Sorry, the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes, but there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them back into the ground, to hide them cleverly, so they would never hurt anyone again. Thanks for listening. Any questions?